Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. Today we dive into a fascinating and controversial reconstruction of history with Simonetta Torresi, who takes us back to the very origins of the Knights Templar, not to repeat the official narrative, but to question it from its very foundations. Through historical inconsistencies, geographical clues, and a radically different interpretative key, this journey challenges everything we think we know about the birth of one of the most mysterious orders in history. Simonetta Torresi opens her discussion of the origins of the Templars by making clear that the analysis focuses exclusively on the beginnings of the order, without addressing the broader history of the Knights of the Temple. This is, in her view, an indispensable premise. Understanding how things unfolded at the start is the only way to grasp how and why these knights developed as they did. The official account, universally accepted and reproduced in virtually every text devoted to the subject, holds that around 1119 a group of knights, identified by many traditions as 11 in number, presented themselves in Jerusalem before King Baldwin I. These men asked for permission to patrol and control the road leading from Jaffa to Jerusalem, with the stated aim of protecting the pilgrims who disembarked at the port of Jaffa and made their way to the Holy City. The king agreed, granting them a wing of his own palace, specifically the eastern section, as their lodging. That area was believed to have once housed the Temple of Solomon, and it stood close to the ancient Al-Aqsa Mosque. During that early period, these men called themselves the Poor Knights of Christ. Before long, however, the title was expanded to Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon, until the formula was shortened simply to Templars. The knights were laymen, despite having taken vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity according to the rule of St. Augustine. They wore no distinctive religious garb and were provided with everything they needed, food, clothing, and all other necessities, by the king himself, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the senior clergy. The order's first seal depicted the Dome of the Rock on one side and two soldiers sharing a single horse on the other. It is at this point that Torresi introduces her critical analysis, urging the reader to apply historical logic before accepting the traditional account at face value. History, she insists, cannot be treated as a fairy tale. It must conform to the rules of logic. And it is precisely logic that brings the first inconsistencies to the surface. Torresi proposes a thought experiment. Imagine 11 people knocking on the door of any sovereign and asking to patrol a stretch of road. Would it be plausible for that king not only to agree, but to house them in a wing of his royal palace, provide for their upkeep, and supply them with everything they needed? The answer is obviously no. Yet that is exactly what the received historical account tells us. And the paradox becomes sharper when one considers that these 11 men were not even religious figures. They were ordinary laymen, which makes the sovereign's extraordinary generosity even harder to explain. There is also a question of scale. The road from Jaffa to Jerusalem covers approximately 54 kilometers. 11 men, however motivated, could not realistically have secured a route of that length. Both the arithmetic and elementary military logic contradict the official version. One element frequently overlooked by scholars, yet considered fundamental by Torresi, is the fact that, in their earliest form, the Templars followed the rule of St. Augustine, not the Bernardine rule with which they are generally associated in popular accounts. Understanding why they chose that particular rule, among so many available, is essential, in Torresi's view, to situating the order correctly within its territorial and cultural context. The Augustinian rule exists in three principal forms: the censoria, also known as the first rule, the ordo monasterii, the second rule, and the preceptum, also called the regula ad servos Dei, or third rule. From the 5th century onwards, certain communities began to organize themselves around these texts, and the rule proved extraordinarily durable. Communities following it still exist today. In the 11th century, the Augustinian rule experienced a revival within communities of regular canons, primarily in France. Torresi does not stop there, but extends her analysis to the geography of monasticism. In March 1244, Pope Innocent IV merged several groups of hermits following the Augustinian tradition into a single mendicant order, the Hermits of St. Augustine of Tuscany, concentrated in Tuscany and Upper Lazio, the Hermits of Giovanni Bono, or Giovanni Tese, present throughout north-central Italy, and the Hermits of Brettino, named after a locality near Fano, in the province of Pesaro, who were particularly numerous in what is now the Marche region, with branches extending into Romagna, Veneto, and Umbria. This last group was the largest, and the fact that it was so deeply rooted in the Marche is, for Torresi, far from incidental. In March 1256, under Pope Alexander IV, no fewer than 360 communities still living according to the Augustinian tradition converged on Rome. On that occasion, the Order of the Hermits of St. Augustine was formally established. With a certain historical irony, these hermits were required to place their monasteries within cities, not in solitude. The order's first saint was Nicholas of Tolentino, born in 1245 and died in 1305, whose cult spread internationally precisely because he was the first canonized member of a newly founded order. Torresi also draws an important terminological distinction. The Augustinians are friars, from the word for brother, because they maintain direct contact with the population. The Cluniac monks, the Cistercians, and the rest are monks, dedicated to the enclosed life. This difference is not merely linguistic. The Pope entrusted the Augustinians with an urban presence precisely because friars, unlike monks, build relationships with ordinary people. At this point in her argument, Torresi introduces a geographical interpretive key that runs through her entire historical reading. If the Augustinian rule was widely established in the Marche, as the documentary and architectural evidence abundantly confirms, then it is legitimate to ask what connection exists between that territory and the knights who adopted that rule. The Augustinian churches in the Marche are, according to Torresi, present in exorbitant numbers. A few examples suffice. Torre di Palm, a hamlet near Fermo, is densely clustered with Augustinian buildings. The sanctuary of Nicholas of Tolentino is the preeminent Augustinian church of the entire region. In Rome, there is even a street named after him, and the saint's name appears in churches in Milan and in religious buildings across the world. The pervasive Augustinian presence in central Italy, and in the Marche in particular, is, for Torresi, a fact that cannot be treated as marginal when discussing the origins of the Templar order. Torresi raises a further question. St. Augustine spent a long time on the Italian peninsula. He was ordained bishop by Ambrose of Milan, and his mother Monica is buried in Rome, in the Augustinian church in Piazza del Popolo, which also houses a famous painting by Caravaggio of the Madonna of Loreto. Yet, according to the conventional account, it was the French who were the first to adopt his rule, not the Italians. For Torresi, this is another question that demands an answer. At a certain point in their history, the Templars find themselves in difficulty on two fronts. Militarily, they are too few, and financially the situation is precarious. And yet, Torresi points out, they were being maintained by the king, the patriarch, and the senior clergy, and had taken a vow of poverty. So why should they be in financial crisis? The narrative once again reveals its cracks. At that point, Hugh de Payens, the group's leader, decides to return to the west. The return journey takes 3 years, a detail Torresi notes with dry irony, observing that one gets a very clear sense of the true distance when it takes that long to cover it. They eventually arrive at Troyes, where a council is held in 1128. Participating in this council are Cardinal Matthew of Albano as papal legate in France, the Archbishop of Reims, and numerous abbots. De Payens' objectives are threefold: to obtain a rule officially recognized by the Church, to secure funding, and to recruit volunteers. The task of drafting the rule is given to Bernard of Clairvaux, who does not volunteer for the role but is expressly summoned. He writes the rule of the Order of the Temple, which the council approves. Many commentators hold that Bernard on this occasion institutionalized the figure of the warrior monk, as though it were an entirely new invention. Torresi challenges this reading. In the tradition of the Maronite monks, deeply rooted in the Marquais and subsequently spread throughout the world as far as Lebanon, the figure of the fighting monk had existed for centuries. Bernard invents nothing. He draws on an already established tradition. With the adoption of the Bernardine rule, a fundamental change of status takes place within the order. The Templars cease to be laymen following the Augustinian rule and become, in every proper sense, monks. Torresi is careful to spell out this distinction. The Cluniacs, the Cistercians, and the Templars after Troyes are monks, figures bound by the rigor of the monastic rule, even when their way of life is anything but cloistered. The Augustinians, by contrast, are friars. The difference is not merely formal. The monk is oriented inward, toward the religious community. The friar is oriented outward, toward the people. The Templars are, paradoxically, warrior monks, men living according to a monastic rule whose task is to fight. It is this combination, which Bernard formalizes but does not invent, that makes the order something radically new within the medieval ecclesiastical structure. Here, Torresi introduces one of the most original and distinctive elements of her interpretation. On previous occasions, she has already argued that the Abbey of Clairvaux, the place from which Bernard took his name, does not correspond to the well-known French abbey, but rather to the present-day Abbey of Fiestre in the Marquais, which still bears the name Caraville today. She has also noted that the so-called Abbey of Clairvaux in France, traditionally associated with Bernard, shows no significant evidence of archaeological excavations beneath it, nor structures consistent with its supposed history. Here, Torresi introduces one of the most original and distinctive elements of her interpretation. On previous occasions, she has already argued that the Abbey of Clairvaux, the place from which Bernard took his name, does not correspond to the well-known French abbey, but rather to the present-day Abbey of Fiestre in the Marquais, which still bears the name Caraville. She has also noted that the so-called Abbey of Clairvaux in France, traditionally associated with Bernard, shows no significant evidence of archaeological excavations beneath it, nor structures consistent with its supposed history. Likewise, Troyes, the site of the famous Council of 1128, is identified by Torresi with Trier in the Marquais. The presence of the Bishop of Sens at the council supports this thesis. Sens, in Torresi's interpretation, corresponds to Senegalia, a town in the Marquais. All the bishops and abbots in attendance would therefore be from the same geographical area. This geographical relocation of the Templars' founding events is the boldest proposal in the entire analysis, and Torresi presents it as the product of a method grounded in documentary evidence and concrete correspondences, not speculation. Returning to the unresolved question, why the king would have housed 11 strangers in his palace, Torresi advances her own hypothesis, which she describes as personal and grounded in logical reasoning. The 11 knights do not arrive by chance. There must have been prior agreements. The king already knew they were coming, and probably knew what they were looking for. It is not a trivial detail that he lodged them precisely in the wing of the palace corresponding to the ancient site of Solomon's Temple. Many authors maintain that the Templars were there to search for the Ark of the Covenant. Torresi does not pronounce directly on this. She works only with documents and concrete evidence. She does, however, acknowledge that something of that kind must have been there, because 11 men could not realistically have fulfilled the role of road guards they claimed to want. Their real mission was evidently something else entirely. After the Council of Troyes and their return to Jerusalem, the Templar Order transforms itself into a genuine military force, forming the backbone of the armies of the Latin states of the East. From that point on, the Templars are no longer 11 road guards. They are an organized army, with hierarchical structures, houses across Europe, and growing influence in the politics of the time. They are not alone in this. The Knights of Malta and the Teutonic Knights perform analogous functions in the Crusades and in the defense of the faith. And yet, Torresi observes, none of these other orders ever acquired the mythical and mysterious aura that surrounds the Templars. The explanation, in her view, almost certainly lies in their end. The Knights of Malta and the Teutonic Knights survive, transform, and continue. The Templars burn at the stake in Paris. And it is precisely that violent and dramatic end that casts over them a light that no other order has ever possessed. Over time, the order also develops innovations that leave deep marks on history. The Templars are credited with coining the term nurse and, above all, with introducing the letter of credit, a system whereby a pilgrim or merchant deposited money at a Templar house before departure and collected it upon arrival at a destination house, with no need to carry physical currency, an anticipation of the modern banking system. During plague epidemics, moreover, certain Templar houses ran lazar houses. In those contexts, the knights carried not a red cross, but a green one. The order is organized on multiple levels. Some houses have a primarily military vocation, while others are esoteric in character, devoted to initiatory paths. Within the order coexist full knights, fighting brethren, and support figures. One episode that remains obscure is the decision of Frederick II, who held the Templars in the highest regard, to expel them from Sicily. The reasons for this choice are not documented, and Torresi states this with intellectual honesty. Simply put, no one knows. Torresi closes her analysis by widening the lens to the historical period as a whole. Traditional schooling, she argues, has conditioned us to think of the Middle Ages as an orderly sequence of emperors, French kings, and popes. But the reality was far more chaotic. In the same span of time in which the Templars arise and develop, emperors succeed one another from Frederick Barbarossa to Frederick II, crusades are launched, new religious orders are born, and temporal and spiritual powers clash. To understand the Templars is to understand this backdrop of radical transformation. The Order's End, which closes with the fires of Paris, an episode to be examined on a future occasion, represents the final chapter of a story that began with 11 knights standing before a king. A story that, when its opening pages are read carefully, already reveals how urgently the official versions need to be questioned. The thread running through Torresi's entire analysis is methodological before it is content-driven. History demands logic, coherence, and evidence. When the traditional account shows gaps or inconsistencies, the scholar's task is not to ignore them, but to interrogate them. This is the invitation she extends to her audience, to resist the received versions and develop a critical, territorially informed reading of the past. That's all for today. See you in the next episode of The Very Origin of Europe, here on Compelling Topics.
I went to